And there I worked on mostly Flash games in support of the shows. The big game I worked on was Fusion Fall, which was an MMO that contained really all of the Cartoon Network original properties. Went from that to produce games for Adult Swim, and now I am freelancing as a writer, director, producer. Not doing so much with games these days, but you never know.
Yeah, hi, my name's Paul Jenkins. I do comics, video games, animation, film, television, and interpretive dance. I have worked on games like Darkness and God of War, Prototype, a number of that stuff. Started with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, wrote the origin of Wolverine for Marvel, and all kinds of stuff like that. There you go.
My name's Eddy Webb. I've worked in both tabletop role-playing games and video games. I've worked with, right now I'm working on Futurama, the mobile game. I've also worked with properties like Firefly, the WWE, Red Dwarf, and the like. So we definitely, all of us here on the table have a wide variety of experiences in working with established franchises. So before we dig into it, I kind of want to go over what this actually means. There's what a franchise is. Means a few different elements, especially as video games start to not only become more and more connected with established intellectual properties, but also start to build their own franchises. So you have the most straight up one, which is adapting for a pre-existing media franchise, so the South Park game, the Futurama game, so on and so forth. You also have expanding an established game series. So if you're making the next Assassin's Creed game, you're making the next Uncharted game, the next Max Effect game, you may come into that with a lot of expectations similar to having a media franchise. And then also you have spiritual successors. So the new Torment game, which is not in any way related to Planescape Torment, but it is the same team. They're coming from the same perspective, and a lot of same elements carry over, even if they're not using specific IP components or characters or setting. So there's a lot of different ways that you can slice that. We're probably going to slide more towards adapting pre-existing IP because that's where a lot of our familiarity is, but a lot of this overlaps into other areas. And one of the first things I want to go into is expectations versus reality. A lot of times when you're writing for established franchises, you usually have a group with a huge fan base, and the second that game gets announced, it's like, oh, well, my favorite character better be into it, or you better have this scene or this moment from that comic book or that movie. How often do you find what you're working on coincides with or differs from those fan expectations?
I could take that. I think first of all, it's important to remember two very important words, which is vocal minority. And a lot of times the fans that are the most vocal at the beginning don't necessarily represent the entirety of the fan base, especially something that's very mainstream like Star Wars or Elder Scrolls or something like that. These franchises have millions of fans, and there might be 10,000 members of a message board who are discussing these things. So it's important to keep that in context, especially as a creative person. And you don't want to let these sorts of fan expectations kind of cloud your thinking in terms of what you're going to perhaps do with characters and so forth. Because it's very easy to get caught up and go down that rabbit hole. And part of the thing is if you're lucky enough to be working on something as a fan yourself, then you'll have your own favorite characters and your own favorite story arcs and your own favorite, whatever elements they are of the franchise. So better to serve yourself and your own creative instincts than, those winds are going to blow constantly, especially on the internet. So it's kind of best to take it in and kind of maybe store it away, but don't let it cloud your judgment. That's kind of my thinking.
Yeah, I think the other thing maybe is, because I do comics as well, and so comic book fans can be pretty much into that as much as video game people. And so I had the opportunity. I kind of pitched to Marvel years ago about that Wolverine didn't have an origin, and so we should do it. And so they said, yeah, okay, that'd be great. And we got to working on it, and that's sort of like a learning lesson, When I took over Spider-Man from Marvel, in fact, I had always avoid kids at shows that have a Punisher t-shirt on, because that's going to be the first problem. And I remember sitting in an audience, and we had this thing at Marvel, so it'd be like literally at Comic-Con, there's like 3,000 people, and you're sort of sitting on a panel, and they're asking you questions. And so a fan once said to me, "What's Spider-Man's favorite flavor of pizza?" And I'd just taken over Spider-Man, and we're sitting there, we have no idea. So I said, "Pepperoni," and the kid just.
And now it's canon.
Well, the kid flips out and starts yelling, "Well, of course you don't know how to write Spider-Man. You're never going to be able to write the character. It clearly says in issue 203 that he didn't like pepperoni pizza." And so it's one of these things, right? Mm-hmm. And we're sitting there like, like Punisher t-shirt, look. So you got to understand that, like when you create something, some people would say, well, you can't write any more new Spider-Man stories, or you can't do anything great with a character in a game that hasn't been done. The answer is, well, I've never done it before. I don't think you should ever listen to other people's anger, because ultimately that same kid that says you can't write Spider-Man, if you look at his email signature, says read my webcomic. So clearly I think it's just a matter of really staying true to the characters, but not listening to what you said, the vocal minority, because that vocal minority's got an awful lot to say very, very loudly. But that's the nature of the internet and message boards. That's why people post, so they can say something.
Do you have something, Bill, too? Or?
Yeah, I just want to mention, way back in the early days of the World of Darkness, it was very clear that the fans were following the meta plot deeper than we were, and they were convinced we had all the answers. And one way around that was Andrew, when he was doing Vampire, would just start screwing with them by putting in all sorts of fake leads and stuff. And one of the big ones was a lot of historical people were vampires, it turns out. And this one was Rasputin, and we kept putting different clans for Rasputin. And everybody kept going, well, which clan is he really? And it was just done to screw people over.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually leads to another point that I'd like to dig into a little bit, is... you obviously, you have vocal minority of people. These people are very passionate about it. But even a larger group of people still have certain expectations. And when you add interactivity to that, there become additional challenges. And there's kind of a sliding scale in my experience of how much interactivity you can or cannot have depending on the property. So on the one hand, you have something like the Futurama mobile game, where there's very little interactivity. It's basically you're following a linear story, but there's bits in the middle of the player plays, as opposed to like the Walking Dead Telltale game, where it kind of happens in a small pocket to one of the seasons, but it does reference certain characters. You can't really impact the main events, but inside the thing you're playing, there's a large amount of possibility. So, in your guys' experience, how much leeway do you usually have in terms of allowing the players to interject themselves into their beloved properties? I mean, it differs by licensor, obviously, but I mean, is there some place where you're surprised at how much you're able to inject, or has it always been pretty kind of, don't touch these certain areas?
Well, let me start. I mean, I think the thing about it is, when you see a movie trailer, it says, Brad Pitt is this guy, Mm-hmm. When you see a game trailer, it says, you are this guy,
right.
And so... The interactivity is clearly defined. You are expected to be this character, and so if it's a licensed character, if it's somebody that exists in, you play Spider-Man or you play the Hulk or something, some character like that, right? So the expectation is for the players to be able to experience and manipulate that character, and it's not a question of did you get it right? Because there is no right in a game. I remember working on the Hulk franchise. We did this game called the Hulk Ultimate Destruction, and it was like a crazy game. It was mad. It was a good game, but most of the time I played Hulk Ultimate Destruction. All I did was grab a giant purple gorilla from a car dealership, jump on top of the things, and then hang around and float around the city. Right? And so one of the things I sort of would talk to the developer about when we started was you got to. That particular game was the first time that the Hulk had actually, it felt like you could smash stuff up as the Hulk, which was kind of the point. And yeah, if someone goes in as the Hulk, and you're playing the Hulk, and they're quite timid. Like I like to stealth. That's my kind of game, right? So I'd kind of like wait around and then look around the corner. That's not exactly the Hulk, is it? The Hulk goes and smashes stuff up. So you've got timid Hulk, you've got crazy Hulk, you've got angry Hulk, you've got aggressive Hulk. It depends on the player, but it changes the character because the player changes the character. So you have to embrace that as a game designer, right?
But on one hand, do you also find that it helps if you have a character that can slide around in those different areas?
Well, the Hulk can't slide around, but it did anyway, right?
Oh, I see.
See what I mean? I mean, the Hulk can't be timid Hulk, but it was if I played it,
Okay.
you know, or at least Sniper Hulk if I could.
Sniper Hulk.
I think, from my experience, it's sort of like you were saying. I think the design sort of dictates the interactivity. You know, for example, in an MMO, like I had a friend who was working on the is it DC Heroes, the DC MMO.
Oh, right.
And you know, we had something that we call the Batman problem, which is if you have an MMO where the players can pick an actual hero, everyone's going to pick Batman. So then you have a game world where there are hundreds of Batman running around and like, you know, 2 Black Canaries.
Yeah. Or the Jedi problem in Star Wars games.
Yes, exactly. So when you're faced with the Batman problem, you kind of have to let either you say, okay, we're going to break the immersion, and we'll have hundreds of Batmen, which I think the kiddie Marvel game did.
Marvel superheroes?
The like SD Marvel, You could basically have tons of Iron Men flying around. They just accepted that as part of the design, but the DC folks didn't think that would work. So, you know, generally what ends up happening is the hero characters become quest signposts or NPC vendors or whatever, and you know, there the interactivity is rather limited. And then maybe you get to like go with Batman into an instance where it's controlled. But I mean, to the earlier point, I think you have to see the design. If you're lucky enough to be in early enough on a game, you can be sitting with the lead designer, you can be talking with the team, so you know sort of what your limitations are with the IP, and then go from there. And that's different than, you know, like Paul was saying, a Hulk game where you're actually playing as the Hulk. You kind of have to give some power over to the player, or you're going to end up with probably a crappy game.
Yeah, some franchises are wide enough to give you a lot of leeway. Like Star Trek, when we were doing Starfleet Academy, you're playing cadets, so you're not pre-existing characters. You can do a lot of what you want with that sort of stuff. In that game, the pre-existing characters, Kirk, Sulu, and such, were in just cinematic cutscenes, so you can get away with a lot of things. And the whole Star Trek franchise, in terms of role-playing games, the tabletop games, it gives you a lot because you're just exploring the world outside of what you're seeing on the TV show. But it also raises another interesting question with those is, when I was working on the tabletop role-playing game in the late 90s, visiting Paramount, there's a whole licensing division that was there back then. I don't know how they do it now since the show's been off for so long. And what was interesting there is there was a division within the licensing department between the Roddenberryites and then the Deep Space Nine guys, the guys who were into the darker, sort of deeper, more political Star Trek.
Would they rumble in the parking lot?
I didn't see it, but I almost got the sense they might. There was that kind of enmity, it seemed.
Wow.
And so you kind of had to know the guy who was approving your stuff, which side was he on? So how could you not step on those toes?
God, it's like I'm having flashbacks to my entire career right now.
It's almost like
you'd be amazed, you know, that when you're writing for franchises, the stuff that you don't legislate for, you think, okay, you know, I'm going to write like characters, or I'm going to deal with history or something, right? And sometimes you don't realize that you're dealing with two, you know, competing factions like that. I had the same. You know, you guys remember Soul Reaver? Remember that video game?
Yeah.
So I worked on Soul Reaver, and it was like the legacy of Kane sort of franchise, and a little bit of insider trading back in the day. Crystal Dynamics had 2 floors, and I worked with Amy Hennig, and so Amy was really brilliant. She ended up going on to be the creative director at Naughty Dog, and she just, you know, really cool lady, and we worked on this story about Gnosticism and in Soul Reaver. And downstairs, they were doing Legacy of Kain, like Blood Omen, and the 2 floors hated each other and used to try to sabotage each other's story in their game. So why are we navigating this? You know, that makes absolutely no sense. But it's still a factor. You have to understand the politics of the company you're
Yep.
working with. You have to understand, because I work in film and television as well, and so, dealing with people in big companies and producers and stuff can be impossible. So you just have to be aware of that stuff.
And I mean, on top of that, there's also what may appear to the writer to be extremely arbitrary distinctions. For example, when I was working on the WWE role-playing game, one of the chapters I worked on was basically kind of the history chapter, which is here's all the different wrestlers and the title histories, so people have a sense of what characters done before. And the two notes we got back from legal, one, which was we don't discuss history in the WWE, which this is before the days of WWE Network, so like now it's like, oh, history's great, but at the time we don't talk about it. And also, we don't use the word wrestler. You have to use the word superstar in all cases. The act of wrestling had to be called performing, which made it really hard to write rules for. There was just no negotiating at this point. This was just how it was, because their branding had gone a certain direction, but also they did not consider that license to be heavy enough weights to have a large discussion about it. So, I mean, the people working on a small indie game or a mobile game may not have the same weight as people working on like a AAA franchise, like a PS3 game or whatever. Different studios sometimes have different abilities to push back. Have you guys run into situations where you come into kind of arbitrary roadblocks from a licensor based on what you're trying to do?
Well, this is kind of a circular way to answer that question, but you will find that you get more roadblocks, I think, from. You have to consider the IP. If the IP is a film or TV-based IP from a more traditional media company, they're not going to necessarily give the same level of attention. Sometimes they think of like, oh, video games, those are
right.
Blah blah. Whereas if you're dealing with an established video game franchise, you're engaging with people who have established that IP on that platform. And so you will find probably either less roadblocks or just different ones coming from a video game IP holder versus a film and television IP holder. And then you also have to think about how much of that particular IP's like if they're not a video game, I'll use Lucas for example. Lucas had at the time I was working on Star Wars stuff for Cartoon Network. Lucas still had LucasArts, so they had a whole division devoted to video gaming. I think they were very pro video gaming. For many years there were people like Warner and Warner finally got their act together, but for a long time they would just license it out to Joe Blow developer, and they'd take their licensing fee and just be like, make whatever. They finally have started to realize that this is a serious, follow the money, right? I mean, it's a serious revenue stream, and where you could before like give Wolverine angel wings and let him fly through, whatever. They now have brand managers for just X-Men or. So it's very different now, I think, and because these things are making millions and millions of dollars. So you may find that you have a good brand manager who may be just like you, a fan of the property, or grew up reading Wolverine or grew up reading X-Men and knows the thing inside and out just like you, or you may be dealing with a marketing person who came up at Rubbermaid and is suddenly the brand manager for
right.
Wonder Woman or something, and they're like, oh, I don't know, whatever. Yeah, I guess she can, cross-dress. Sure.
Wonder Woman doesn't use enough Rubbermaid.
That was actually her original name, Rubbermaid.
Rubbermaid, right?
Oh, that's awesome. I like that.
But on the flip side, if you're actually managing one of these brands, an IP, and instance at White Wolf back when we started doing a fiction division and stuff, it wasn't coordinating fully with the gaming side.
Right.
The gaming side was,
People are laughing. That is what we call an understatement.
we were building the IP and they were kind of just using it. And
right.
the problem was they were hiring writers who weren't paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
And that is diluting the IP in terms of fiction. Because
right,
when somebody
exactly.
picks up, they want to read a werewolf book, they pick it up, and this isn't at all like werewolf, they're never going to pick up another one again. So, you do want to defend these brands and stuff when it's your job, and you want to help, I think, as a licensor, your brand manager do that too, as long as they're not someone from Rubbermaid who has no idea what they're doing.
Well, and I mean, I know having been on that side when I was kind of helping at TCP with the IP management as well, a lot of times, like you said, people don't know what they need to be referencing, but also there's just time commitment because a lot of times for these license contracts, there's 5-day, 10-day, if we don't hear from you, we'll assume it's fine and go forward because the person making the product's on a very strict timetable and they need to get stuff out the door. But if you're given a 300-page novel manuscript, you have to read it in 10 days, there may not be a company who has the ability to do that. It's easy. It really depends on the company. Some companies, like White Wolf and Dave, was a little more permissive, and that led to a problem. Other companies like Disney, it's like, they'll put the brakes on, they'll say, no, until we review this, you're not going any further. And they're very aggressive about it.
Yeah, like what? See all this grey hair? It's because of that, dealing with difficulties, and also because I've been doing this for a long time, right? And so I have been a licensor with Ninja, where we controlled it and it was ours, and we sort of built it from scratch. And next thing you know, we're in charge of it. Mm-hmm. I've been at Marvel. When I started at Marvel, they were in Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and it seems absurd now that they were in bankruptcy. But in the mid '90s, they couldn't give themselves away. They were about to go Chapter 7. And that's a time where they come to people like me and say, hey, that clever stuff you do, could you do that for us? Because we're about to go out of business. Mm-hmm. And so it depends on the time, it depends on the situation you're in. But I can tell you, an example, and this is in comics, but it still applies to the same kind of thing. When I started working with them, they were in trouble. They just didn't know what to do. And so they basically said, do whatever you like. And we did, and it did pretty well for them. And next thing you know, they're like, okay, great. But I think it was literally 2006, 2007 maybe, and we had just done Civil War, right? So Civil War was really did well, and then we were about to do a follow-on, and they started telling me, you need to do this and that, and I'm like, when did you ever tell me to start doing these things?
Right.
That was a year before they sold to Disney. And you knew it. You could see it coming, right?
Yep.
You could see it. And at the time, I was like, why are you telling me to do these things when you've never done that before and we've built you up? And it was because they had a specific reason for doing it. They wanted to lock up the IP, sell it to Disney. They weren't going to tell anybody. So it's ever-changing, right?
Yep,
the winds have changed. You talk about these millions of dollars that they made. Yeah, but Iron Man wasn't Iron Man until they made it Iron Man. Right. Like, no one in the country or the world knew who Iron Man was till they made that movie, and it was quite good, and next thing you know, it's a massive franchise. It just depends. I mean, it depends on the wind direction and the time of day.
And the minute that Iron Man becomes the $1 million franchise, if you listen carefully, you can hear all the lawyers and all the marketing people like assembling around that IP, because suddenly, just like what Paul was saying, suddenly they have an Iron Man brand Bible, and they're telling you what he can and can't do, and how many African American characters he can talk to, and whether he's in a same-sex relationship or not, and there's all the, forget the alcoholism,
and what's important about that is it can be very frustrating as a creative person, because if you think about something like for me, I wrote the Inhumans for Marvel, right? And so they had sort of, hadn't done anything for years. Jack Kirby created them. They were sort of never made it. And then I came in, and I had been writing Hellblazer for DC at the time. So we're still talking about comics, sorry, but so when I came in, they sort of said, can you write these guys? Like, I'm like, yeah, who are they? I've never heard of them. So I write them, and we ended up doing really well. Won an Eisner Award, and they said, oh my God, this is great. And we came back years later, they said, would you write part 2? I said, why would I write part 2 when I've already done so well? I'll never go back there again. But the next thing you know, it's like I have an army of lawyers standing outside my front door. Sign this, you got to do this. I'm like, whoa, where'd this come from? Like all of a sudden, everything changed, because once the stakes change. Right. So there's something very small right now that might even be in this room or might even be at this conference. It's a very small thing. And once it gets big, the rules change completely. Yep. And sometimes things that are really big, like the A-Team in the 80s, right? Like some mates of mine bought that for nothing because it was never happened. And then next thing you know, they're trying to remake it. So it just depends on the time and all of that,
Absolutely. And I think similar, like working on Futurama right now, luckily, similar like you were with individuals that were working directly with the guy who worked directly with Matt Groening. So I mean, it's again very small license pool, but also because it's been off the air for a few years, I think we have a little more flexibility because there's not a immediate financial thing going into Fox. So they're like, okay, well, we'll just see how this plays out and we'll go from there. And then now it's adapted for a second game, and there's a slight uptick in culture around Futurama as a result. We've luckily not seen any of those restrictions come in, but there have been a couple times, like, we tried to introduce a completely new character into the game, and there was a much longer approval process for that, because they're ultimately were adding to the canon in some ways of Futurama, and they were still very concerned about that and wanted to protect that. But it was, again, I think it was a little more flexibility than if we were doing it 5 years ago when it was out and very, very popular. But actually, that kind of relates to another topic, is especially for these franchises that we're bringing back from a long time, had they kind of laid dormant. Sometimes there's bits of those older franchises that do not update well. That they have outdated perspectives on gender or race, for example. And you're expected to do the new video game adaptation or the new comic book adaptation to bring it to the modern day. How do you approach those kind of, it's always been this way versus we need to make this approachable to a modern, savvy audience? I know you have opinions on this.
Yeah.
You want to take that?
But how much power do they give you to do that? Like you said, if it's nothing.
Assuming you have a moderate amount of power, because so sometimes, to be fair, in my experience, if they're saying this has been dormant for a while, we want you to reinvigorate, like Paul said, it's like sometimes just go nuts, but usually it's a matter of we want you to do something fresh with this. So less of a how much can you push against the licensor, and now I'm talking a little more about this has been around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and the fans have certain expectations of this property, and you're expected to be involved in trying to take it in a new direction, which sometimes happens a fair bit with video games being a pilot to try to find out if there's still an audience for this thing. So how would you approach this kind of changes?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done it myself, so I can't say. It's interesting to look at Marvel. I was seeing someone online commenting recently. Like, just in Iron Man, when they used the Mandarin, at first you thought, oh my God, how can you touch that sort of character? But they did that whole twist on it to where they were commenting on that sort of thing. So that's an interesting way to do it.
Yeah, like Inhumans had a character that was important to me because her name is Medusa, right? So you look at all of these characters in the Inhumans, and you probably don't know them, but because they're stupid as hell. But you got Black Bolt, and if Black Bolt speaks, the whole world blows in half, and he's super powerful, and his wife has hair that punches people. Because Stan Lee created her, right? So it's like, it's not exactly going to be flying the feminist flag, is it? And so, I actually had that challenge, and it was, she, in the series that I wrote, became the most important character to the series, the way that the things that she sacrificed and did. But it is tough, I mean, you're taking things that are very outdated. Right. Some things are outdated technology-wise. Some things are. I mean, I learned a long time ago. Like every time you write iPhone goes obsolete. Or you write a thing. So you have to be super careful about even referring to like political climate, things that are only relevant now. Right. I ran into it many years ago because I wrote something about MySpace, and this is when MySpace was going, right? And now people go, ha, he wrote about MySpace. Yeah. I'm like, well, I get that because it was going then.
Right.
What can
you should see my Friendster material. It's really good.
Yeah. So it's impossible. You can't.
Sure.
There's no one way of.
But I mean, also, I think, especially when we're talking about video games, there comes additional wrinkle because to use Game of Thrones as an example, it's not necessarily an older property, but Game of Thrones is a very specific narrative reason why they present women the way they do. But now I'm a female player playing Game of Thrones. We don't want them to necessarily feel that way. We don't want them to feel powerless in this male-dominated world because we want them to enjoy our property and our game as much as anybody else. So it's like you have to duck around that. Do you address it? Do you just ignore it? I mean, it's a tough challenge.
Well, I think that's kind of the fun of being a creative person is that you can. Just in that example, you can do a clever sidestep and say we're going to set the game at Castle Black where there's only men, and make it about defending the wall or something, and that can be a very compelling idea, and you're not really addressing that issue. Now, are you beholden to kind of make the sort of gender issues of Game of Thrones part of your game? I don't know.
Right.
But but there are ways to get around certain things that can also deliver exactly what the fans want and make a great experience. It's just with something like Game of Thrones, which is such a rich world, that you don't want to cover everything anyway.
Yeah, I think it's such a. I mean, don't you want that flavor? Don't you? You see these gender issues being discussed, and you go, "I want to write about that. I want that to be in the game. I want those things because that's cool." I write about that stuff all the time, but I don't want to be a crusader for something. What's the point? I want to write great stories, and at that point, by default, you're highlighting these things. So I would. If I had Game of Thrones, I'd want to write that stuff into it and make sure that was part of the subtext.
Yeah, I guess it's like I said. I guess it's like just what you're attracted to as a creator.
Sure.
I don't actually find the gender issues in Game of Thrones all that compelling. I feel like it's more about the power struggles of the different families and so forth. But that's just my picadillo. I mean, there's going to be somebody else who comes in and maybe has a different approach to it. So
sure, and I think kind of where I'm coming from is I think the broader issue is that when you have a property, what decisions that were made with that property when it was primarily a linear experience, it was made as a movie, made as a comic, and you're trying to adapt it to an interactive experience, there are going to be areas where it's gonna rub up. It's not going to be as good as an interactive experience because of the either overt or subtext that gets applied to it. And also on top of that, there are other wrinkles like App Store or Steam ratings that you have to worry about. ESRB ratings. I ran into this again on Futurama and a little bit on Firefly, is because how you present alcohol and how you present sex can't be done certain ways in certain markets. And doing it for a cartoon, primarily United States based, is one thing, but doing it on the Apple App Store, completely different. So I got weird things like Bender can't reference porn, which is really hard to write around at times because that character. But I mean, there's other things you can do with that character. The character's rich enough that you can explore different things. And weirdly, smut was fine by Apple. I don't know why, but it was one of those things where you notice, or even humor. Sometimes the things that are funny for a purely linear experience, don't work well in an interactive experience because you hear the same joke 17 times. So repeat that.
That's been a horrible thing. If you. And that's, writing dialogue for games. I mean, if you write and you hear a funny joke one time, great. If you hear that funny joke twice, maybe hear it 4 times, oh God, stop it.
Right.
And yet the greatest piece of humor in video games ever is Homer Simpson running people over going, "I am evil, Homer." That's always good no matter how many times you hear it.
That's true, right. Sometimes it maps really well, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so at this point, if you guys have any questions, feel free to step up to the mic and we'll be happy to answer them. Or otherwise, we will just continue to randomly talk about war stories for the next half an hour.
Go ahead, man.
Yeah, first, thank you all. The stuff that you guys have worked on over the years has provided me hours upon hours upon hours of untold entertainment. I'm a huge fan of just about every single project that you've ever worked on. Hulk Ultimate Destruction was one of my favorite video games of all time.
Sniper Hulk, telling you, man.
Sniper Hulk.
So my question to you would be this: I've got an interesting character.
Mm-hmm.
I want to immortalize this character into a video game, and it's one of the problems I'm having with is capturing the essence of this character isn't necessarily difficult, but I'm having a hard time figuring out how to create a good environment or world for this character to operate in. So I was wondering a little bit about the creative process. Is it better to create an environment first, or if you have a good idea like this, what is a good way to create a sort of space for them?
Are you talking for a video game specifically, or?
Yeah, I am looking at a video game specifically, but right now I really don't have any limitations or restrictions on how to create this. I was just
Sure. I mean, for me, the first question I would have is, what does this character do? If this character is doing something, and then give them an environment to do that thing and make it increasingly interesting for them to keep doing that thing. Because the Hulk game is actually a perfect example of this, is like the game's ultimate destruction. If the core of what Hulk is doing in this game is breaking things, then the gameplay needs to be about breaking things, and the environment and the world needs to give lots of opportunities to break things. There's more complexity that can go beyond that, but really at that point, you're talking about a character of action because the player is going to be playing that character or involved with that character.
This is why Paul put a China shop in that game.
That's right. Yeah. But I tell you what, actually, it is this thing that we do, right? We have, like, okay, films are one thing, and comics are one thing, and this and that. And so video games are this thing. Video games are a mix, depending if they're story-based, of sort of compelling, thought-provoking things that make you sort of think about entertainment. You know, what Greeks created theater so that we could, you know, purge our emotions or something. That's why we are entertained. At the same time, we're trying to do not just storytelling, but gameplay, right? Gameplay is a specific kind of thing. It's a mixture of storytelling and gameplay in a story-based game. So when I teach writing and stuff, you know, one of the first things I kind of say to people is, does it deserve to exist? Like, if it doesn't deserve to exist yet, tell me how it can deserve to exist. Now, if it's a movie, you've got to say, well, the central character, do I identify with that person or whatever? But that's not always the case in a game, because it's not a matter of just identifying with a character. Remember, you create the character. You make the character do things. So you already identify with that character to some extent, because it's you, right? So in a game, it's do you have a sufficient mix of, like, sort of emotional feeling that you can get the players to feel? You know, can you engineer their emotions to a place? And at the same time, can you give them something rad to do? You know,
right.
Blowing stuff up in Hulk is awesome. Getting two halves of a VW bug and making iron fists out of them and then punching stuff with it, that's the best thing ever, right? And especially giant purple gorillas on top of car dealerships. so it's just a matter of, like, knowing. And if you're not convinced, in my opinion, if you're not convinced that you definitely have it yet, you can't go out with it until you definitely know that you do have it.
Right.
You have to be harder on yourself about whether or not it's actually fun and compelling than anybody will be on you, because at that point, stay true to it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, example being the Hulk he's the perfect, you know, embodiment of that kind of destruction. Whereas if you had a game of Captain America going around doing that, it just would be off. It just wouldn't feel right. So, you know, what's the character's background and how does he fit into those actions he's doing? How do they express who he is?
Can I just sort of say, like, one thing that you may want to be able to, like, I'll sit with you after this, okay? We'll sit down, we'll talk about your things. You pitch it to me and we'll talk. But the question is, can your character, can you justify your character's thing? That's exactly the right comment, right? If you gave Iron Man things to do that the Hulk would do and it doesn't ring true, it's a lie. It's never true. You shouldn't move forward with that kind of thing. So as long as you stay true to the game and it's a mix of those two things, you'll be fine. I think, you know?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm sure you all have an appreciation for traditional literature, yes? So how do you go about wrapping that kind of writing around a player in, let's say, an RPG to make it adaptable to the player, to kind of immerse them in a way that you can't do with any other form?
That's a good question. But what literature are you talking about? Give me, I mean, when you say traditional literature, are you talking about?
I mean in the traditional sense of, like, character arcs in a story, how you're wrapped up in it, and the motivations. How do you apply that to a player, make them feel motivated, make them feel like they're written into this world, but without actually being written into where they're affecting it, interacting with it, shaping it as well? You have to write for that and take into account all the different possibilities they could go with.
Well, let me see if I can re-articulate it to you guys, because I think a way of looking at that would be in traditional things, you know, book, film, whatever, there's acts, right? You know, how do you fit to a structure of acts? You know, how do you get to the premise after the end of Act 1? How do you go explore it? How do you turn it on its head halfway through? How do you do that in a video game when, in fact, a video game, you may start and go, I think I'm going to play that mini game for 78 hours, which is what I do with giant purple gorillas in the Hulk. You know, like, I didn't follow the linear story. So the question, I think, guys, is, like, can we do that? Can we do acts? Can we pace a story? Or how do we do that?
I think you do that, but I mean, again, it's all about the design, right? So if you have an open world game like Hulk or GTA, for example, where you've given the player so much freedom, then it's a question of, you know, the phrase on rails. Like, it's a question of how much of the game is on rails where you're pushing. It's how much control you have over the story arc. And you know, the people who do great are Telltale. So they have a very particular story arc that they want the player to enjoy, that has some branching paths, And you feel like you have some control over the situation because you're making choices. But Telltale and their designers have already figured out, sort of where those boundaries are. And so they can highly control that story arc, have a 3-act structure, have the twist, have the conflict that feels more film-like. But if you have an open-world RPG where you don't know what the player will be doing at any given time, you have a different kind of experience. And so that design doesn't lend itself, I think, as much to what you're describing as something that, and it could be something in the middle, like The Last of Us is a great example of something that's got or Uncharted, they have very cinematic, and it's not literature, but it's got a literary feel to it. But that's because of the way the design supports that.
On the other end, you also have games like Gone Home, where nothing's put into your character's mouth. You're basically just exploring a house, and you're finding about the struggle that this girl's having, and so the physical space maps to an emotional exploration. So in this case, you're not giving choices to a character, and that character's path isn't changing, but how you explore that character's emotional journey is up to you. So there may be sides of this girl's emotional experience that you never come into because you don't put that cassette tape into the recorder, or you don't read her diary, but you still get the bits and pieces of it. So it becomes more about how you explore another character in a way that traditional fiction doesn't allow, because it's very much page to page to page, whereas you get to explore a character ad hoc, and okay, well, I'm reading now about her childhood, and now I'm reading about the fight she had with her girlfriend and all that. So that's another way where you explore a character's emotional journey as if it were geography, which is why I think Gone Home is particularly brilliant, because it literally gives you geography to explore, and then you realize, oh, I'm actually exploring a person's life.
Yeah, I think the game Vampire Bloodlines is a good example of a really good balance between story and then just open sort of action. You run into enough NPCs and build enough of the world and the story to know what their motivations are, how they're working with the world, and then it's punctuated by you going off and doing enough open sort of stuff. Like there's a haunted house scene in there that is just so moody and really kind of scary, even though not much happens. But it's given enough resonance because why you went there in the first place from the person who sent you there, and it's few games, I think, it's really tough to achieve that balance between having a lot of story and then all that. The more open it is, the harder it is then to put in the story, because linearity is so much involved in these acts and structures and so on.
Yeah, sometimes maybe you want to ask yourself the question, like I get your question, which is, can you structure it in sort of a form that makes us feel as though we're moving through acts and following characters and all of that, and that's cool. But sometimes with a game, I'm not so sure if you like need to or want to, even if it's a story-based game. So a good example of that would be a game called Fatal Frame, which was sort of like you walk around in a haunted house in Japan, I guess, probably dressed as a schoolgirl, I think, and you take photographs of ghosts with this camera that like captures them. I'm not so sure that does it have a story? Does it have a thing? And you get to the end of their arc or something. I'm not so sure. If we don't remember, it probably doesn't.
There are plot elements, but I mean, it's not. Yeah,
it's not. Feel like it had a story.
Okay, but here's the thing.
Right.
Yeah, what was interesting about Fatal Frame was that they did a great story of kind of making us think this. They did a great job of this thing where I'm walking around with this camera, and you go, well, where's that bloody ghost? And the heartbeat makes you think, boom, boom, boom. It ratchets up as you get closer to a ghost, and then there's one around because you're pointing it, and you look up and there's a ghost hanging by its neck, looking down at you, and you go like that, right? Well done to them, because they made you feel something. Question is how we define story, and I have a very, very broad definition of story. I think story is the engineering of other people's emotions.
Right.
So,
I mean, I think that's a really good point, is that we as humans are wired to make stories. If we have a bunch of random events, afterwards we will construct it into a logical narrative. That's how conspiracy theories are ultimately constructed, is because people want to take what appear to be random events and make them make sense. So even if you have a game where there's arbitrary things happening, I mean, it's not going to be a particularly compelling story, but a story will emerge from that. So if we can add components to make people want to put those pieces together and build their own narratives, then they're going to be even more strongly compelled. I think a good example of this is EVE Online. It's ultimately a trading/war simulator, but some amazing stories, year-long stories have come out of it, of espionage and betrayal and treachery, and it's all player actions. The game itself doesn't do any of that. This would give them the tools to which they can betray each other. But that's a very specific experience. It takes a particular kind of player to get into, but stories do result from that. So, it is possible for a game to have a classical literature structure, but also that does not necessarily mean that games are without story if they don't follow that structure. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so would you agree that character makes plot, therefore you can't have a plot without some sort of character defining it? So how do you go about writing those characters in a way that they can coexist with the player?
Well, that's the key point, right? It's not, can you write those characters and give the player the rules of what that character is? You can give them the basics of what that character are, right?
Yep.
And then you can't control what the player's like. So we went back to that thing I was saying about Timid Hulk and Sniper Hulk and all of that. You give them the tools to make a story, and you give them story elements, but you cannot. So in a game, it's a lot different than in a novel. It's different in a novel than a comic or some other thing, or a movie. I don't know if you have to adhere to that. I don't think you have to worry about it too much. I think you have to be, because The Last of Us, right? That was a great example of a game. What it does, it makes you think you're in the film of it. It makes you care about characters. They use, and knowing those guys as I do, I know how hard it was for them to make that game feel that way. There's a lot of giving you the impression that you have control when you do not have control. They're handing you the illusion of control.
Yep.
But they're handing you a story, and it makes you feel a certain thing, and you journey with these characters, and you go up and down in the relationships between people. So it's a triumph of storytelling. It makes you care about the girl. It makes you care about the characters involved, and it does a really amazing job of it, right? But if you feel like you must control the way the narrative works completely, write a novel or something. It's just never going to happen. Yeah?
Just someone behind you has a question. So.
I do just want to add, though, as for literature and gaming, I am looking forward to Pride and Prejudice Ultimate Destruction.
Seriously, that would be amazing.
This is more about the writing process itself, and when I write my characters, I don't really have a good guy or a bad guy, because those stereotypes kind of hinder your story. Because when you say good guy, you expect a right guy all the time, like the Batman example. Batman's the good guy, but he knows Joker's doing bad things, but when he stops Joker, he just arrests him. Joker gets out. It's a non-ending process. So how do you write a story with no defining good guy or bad guy without offending someone? Because I know everybody has that argument with Batman about he lets Joker go all the time. So how do you write a story without people feeling like, well, this character's not as good as you say it is, or this character's not as bad as you say it is?
I will tell you that one of the most interesting examples of what you're describing is the original Gundam series from 1978, which is going way back. But as we're Americans and we consume mostly Western stuff, there's the guy with the black hat and the guy with the white hat in most things. And I remember first seeing Gundam, which I wouldn't have gone and checked out on my own, but it was airing on Toonami, and I was working on Toonami, and so I had to watch this stuff, and I'm 6 episodes in, and I'm like, who's the villain? Like, I couldn't tell, and it was compelling for that reason, actually, and you've seen other examples of it now in more modern stuff, and it's escaping me like off the top of my head, but I know that there are movies and so forth where the lines are grayed and
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Game of Thrones is a perfect example. That's true. It is not black hat, white hat. It's very, they're good people doing bad things, bad people occasionally doing good things. So I'm not really sure what the original question was. But
to kind of build off that, I think there's a confusion between making a character. We talk about a lot of times of making characters sympathetic, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with their actions. It simply means that we have to identify with them. And it's one thing to say, I would never kill somebody, but there have been moments where I've been angry enough I feel like maybe I'd want to. That's still sympathy. That's still something a character. I need to talk to you privately later. But I mean, yeah. So I mean, you can make a character that is sympathetic without necessarily making them morally upright all the time.
Yeah, because when I like all my games are stored in the handbook notebooks right now, and all my characters have that, like the good guys have like questionable flaws, and the bad guys have like justifiable reasons.
That's actually a really good point.
Okay, but that's what makes them interesting. Like
Yeah.
two things on that, right?
I don't want players to be like, well, I don't agree with this. How can you call this person a good guy, or how can you call this person a bad guy? Because they're like,
You-
I have a lot, you know.
Okay, you brought up Batman, Joker.
Yes.
Like, Batman and Two-Face are the same people, right? The psychological difference between a cop and a killer, they say, the psychological profile is similar, you know? Depends on which way you go. But the way to look at it is, I hope, or one thing that might help you is instead of worrying about it, right? You don't need villains don't work the way that we try to make them work. You say good guy, bad guy. It never is. You ever met anybody that was like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy were broken human beings that were so innately broken that they weren't even evil because they were that sick, right? Mm-hmm. Here's a story. You got some old guy. He's granddad. He's a nice old guy. You see these old home movies of the guy, and he's hanging out, right? And he's got the dog. He's got the German Shepherd, and the German Shepherd comes up, and he's like, hey, what's happening? The little grandkid comes up, hey, little buddy, how you doing? And it's great to see him on holiday in Bavaria, because that guy who's nice to his grandchildren was Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. Nice to little kids, loved animals, had the capacity to be nice to people.
He was a painter.
Had some elements of creativity within him, mm-hmm. and yet was the most evil human being that ever lived. Well, why was he the most evil? Because he had the capacity for love and passion and goodness, but he made these choices that were entirely evil. In other words, don't ever make one guy only do bad things. They do everything. People do everything, you know?
Okay. So keep my kids complex.
Yes, absolutely. So she has a question too.
Although that does remind me of that Stephen King story. I think they made it into a movie with Ian McKellen, to where he's an aging Nazi, and the all-American boy next door is way more evil than he is.
Yeah. Right, yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of chilling, because here's a guy who's supposed to be the embodiment of all evil, having been an ex-Nazi, but it turns out, the American kid's way worse.
Absolutely, that's very true.
Okay, hi. So first of all, I would like to have like a 2-hour conversation with each of you. I'm studying narrative in games at Old Dominion.
Oh, wow.
And so all of this is fascinating to me. I just wanted to bring up, you guys, first of all, we've talked about Game of Thrones. We've also talked about stories on rails and things like that. In Telltale games, I don't know how many of you have played.
I've played a lot of them.
Their version of Game of Thrones specifically. It's interesting because they do have, you play a number of different characters in different chapters, and one of those is a female character that has a lot of agency. Who's one of Marjorie's handmaids, basically, and she does all this political stuff, and it's really cool. But that's very much a story that you feel like you have a lot of agency, but it's very, very much on rails.
Right.
And for me, that was a game where they gave you the impression that you had agency, and I saw a lot of people talk about this. When you got to the end, you were like, I had no agency at all. On the other hand, when you look at their Walking Dead game, it feels, I was blown away at how much agency it felt like you had. All of your choices, they would give you 4 choices, but you could play Stealthy Hulk. You could go in lots of different directions. So, and also in reference to what some other people have said, I agree 100% with what you said, that if you want to tell a purely linear story, don't make it a game. That's something that Bill and I worked on a lot at White Wolf, was a lot of people who had a story and they didn't want players to mess with it. They didn't want them to interact with it.
Right.
So can you guys talk just a little bit about how to make it... I've seen a lot of games that fail to make you feel like you have agency.
Right.
And I mean, in some games, you're not supposed to. And they don't give you the impression from the get-go that you do, that you're just out there, fighting stuff or whatever. But do you have any advice on how to hide the rails effectively?
I do. Well, The Last of Us, as we mentioned, is a perfect example, because they clearly had that story worked out ahead of time, and it's paced beautifully in the game. Again, you have to kind of let the design dictate how many breadcrumbs you're going to sort of leave. I think a good a blueprint for this kind of thing is to look at your story and think about what are the tentpole moments, what are the beats that I know the player has to hit to make this work. And then you set that up in such a way so that you are essentially funneling the player to those moments. In between those moments, it's up to you how much agency you want to give them. So The Last of Us, you have a story moment, you walk into that loading dock or whatever, and suddenly it's an open firefight, and there are specific things that you have to, there's trigger moments that happen, but essentially the player has full agency how they're going to approach that particular scenario. And then they get to the end of that scenario, rails, and suddenly it's a story moment, and it's a beat, and if it's done well, like it is in The Last of Us, you feel
like you've contributed to it?
Exactly. There are other games where you get to that moment and you're like, skip, don't care, don't care, don't care.
Isn't that a huge part of it, right? Like, so I am really vocal about not liking cutscenes. I just don't think that they should exist in a game, because I think that if the rules of a game are our thumbs manipulate us through whatever on a console game or something, then that should be the rule of the game. And so, The Last of Us did such a great job with the cutscenes that the best way to do cutscenes, in my opinion, is to make them a reward because they're so good.
Right. Yep.
Right? Halo does really well, actually. They do really good cutscenes, and so you feel like that you got something happening. You care about the characters.
What the story is, I have no idea. But
Yeah. But I mean, but their cutscenes.
But it's pretty.
But their cutscenes do this one thing that I think works, which is they always go on this whole thing about like soldiers and Marines, and so when you watch it, you go, rah, because you kind of like see what they're putting together. They at least make it worth it to watch it.
It encourages you to role play a certain way, not that role playing relatively.
So it's just a question. I think it might be something to do with that. Like if you're going to guide somebody through a game, they really take you on rails every time they put you. I mean, you don't control it. It's a cutscene. You have to watch it, right? With Last of Us, so well done, and I just know a lot of what they were trying to do was things like how do we use motion capture to really get facial nuance, and how do we angle our cameras, and what do we do? So they're filmmakers,
it's very
as well as game players, game makers. So it's just a question of like how you put the whole thing together and the diligence with which you do it. It didn't get made overnight, that game,
of course,
and Uncharted, they're like that a lot. Some of these better games really don't get made overnight. They get a ton of iteration.
Right. And I've had the privilege of being able to work with Dave Grossman, who was one of the founders of Telltale. He worked on Monkey Island games. And I'm working with him on a project right now. And one of the first things he taught me was that when you're breaking down a game, like talk about those various set pieces, what are the key moments of choice? And that happens way back at the outline. And all of the key moments of choice that we kept gravitating to were like the earlier question, they're not black and white. They're not obvious choices.
Right.
It's like, do I save this person and watch my town get overrun, or do I go rush to my town and the person I'm saving gets killed?
Right.
Those are not easy choices. But the second piece of that is that something has to happen. I need feedback to know that mattered. And I think that's where you talk about Game of Thrones falls down, is because you have lots of really compelling choices, but no feedback that mattered because you're jumping characters.
Right.
As opposed to Walking Dead, because it's ultimately an emotional game. Are you seeing people's reactions to your decisions, even previous episodes? It feels like you're making a change in the world because the world is the character reactions, not all of Westeros.
Right.
So if you have those key moments and then you get feedback from those choices, then that's where you get more of a feeling of agency, even if the plot does not get changed in a significant way.
Right.
And on that note...
Okay, sorry about that.
That's fine. We're just out of time, so I just wanted to say thank you guys very much for coming up, and thank you guys for coming out. Appreciate it.